Looking at the front panel, you will notice that it is divided into sections. To the left of the display, or under the display, in the case of the rack, is a row of 8 buttons. Pressing these buttons takes you to the 2600's 8 operational modes. The names of the modes are printed in white. Underneath, or to the side of this, you will notice that the buttons also have a blue label, and some of the buttons have an orange label. When you're editing a program and are in the program editor, then the blue labels apply to these buttons. When you're editing a sample within the sample editor, the orange labels apply. If you have the keyboard, then you also have 3 extra buttons under the mode buttons. These are dedicated to the sequencer, allowing you to start, stop, pause, and record, no matter which mode is currently shown in the display. Directly under the display is a row of 8 buttons. The edit and exit buttons are used to enter and exit the various editors found in the different modes. The middle 6 buttons are called soft buttons because their function changes according to where you are in the software menus. You'll notice 6 blocks at the bottom of the display. The blocks change names in relation to the function displayed on the screen. For instance, when you first turn on the 2600, you're in the program mode, and the soft buttons are used to transpose by octave, change MIDI channels, change the way programs are displayed, or send a MIDI all notes off message. If you have a rack version of the 2600 and just tried pressing these buttons, you may have noticed that pressing the octave plus or minus buttons had no effect. Don't worry, this is normal. We'll explain about this in just a moment. To the left of the display are the channel bank buttons. Although these buttons have different functions depending on which mode you're in, they always work in the same manner. When there are multiple pages which show the same thing, they'll move you through those pages. For example, in program and several other modes, they'll switch you through the 16 MIDI channels. In quick access mode, they switch to the different quick access banks. In song mode, they switch record tracks. And if you're editing programs or setups, then the green label under the button applies, switching you through layers in a program or zones in a setup. To the right of the display are buttons used for navigating and data entry. The 4 arrow buttons move the cursor around in the various edit screens, and also scroll through programs and setups when in those modes. The wheel and the plus and minus buttons are used to scroll through the values of the various parameters, and the numeric keypad is used to directly enter specific values. If you have the keyboard, then you also have a section marked Assignable Controllers. There are 8 sliders with 8 buttons above them. The sliders can be used for real-time control of virtually any aspect of the sound. The sliders also have a special function when playing a KB3 program. KB3 programs are special programs which model the way a real Hammond B3 organ works. In this case, the 8 sliders work just like drawbars on a real Hammond, and the mod wheel is the 9th drawbar. The buttons above the sliders have different uses, depending on where you are in the instrument. When you're playing a KB3 program, then the labels above the buttons apply, allowing you to do things like turning on percussion, vibrato, and the rotary effect. In setup mode, the buttons will light for each zone used in the current setup. The light will be green if the zone is currently active. If you press a button, it will mute that zone and the light turns orange. You can easily change timbres by using these buttons. If you create a setup with many zones, you can quickly change your sound by simply muting and unmuting various zones to create different combinations. The sliders can be used to send any kind of controller message. As you play through the preset programs and setups, make sure to move the sliders to hear the variations you can create in the sound. To the left of the sliders is a button marked solo. This will solo the currently selected zone. The first time you press the button, it will solo zone 1. The zone button light will turn red. You can then solo any zone by pressing its button. Here I have layered 3 different sounds. By pressing the solo button, I can move back and forth between the different sounds and quickly switch my soloing sound. Below the solo button is the mix down button. This page lets you use the sliders to easily send MIDI volume or pan messages when you're working on a song. The third button on the left is called MIDI faders. This page allows you to create a preset configuration of any controller number assignment for each slider, along with an initial preset value for that controller. For each slider, you can assign the MIDI channel, controller number, and value. You can enter the value manually or use the slider to set the value. You can set several sliders to the same channel, but have each one assigned to a different controller number. There are 4 different configurations, which are called up by the soft buttons. Each configuration remembers the last value you set for each slider. If you want to send those values without moving the slider, press the Send button. Now let's talk about the other physical controllers on the keyboard. One of the first things you notice about the K2600 is the large ribbon controller placed above the keyboard. The ribbon senses movement when you press on it and when you move your finger up or down. The ribbon can be used as a single long strip, or if you want, it can be divided into 3 separate zones, each programmed to do something different. These zones are indicated by the 2 smaller arrows above the strip. There also is 1 large arrow directly to the center of the strip to give you a visual indication of the center point when you're using the ribbon as 1 long strip. One typical way you might use the ribbon is to bend pitch. This works especially great for lead programs. You will also notice a small ribbon controller located below the wheels. This ribbon is both pressure and movement sensitive, so it will respond to both my finger moving from side to side and from pressing down. You can program this ribbon so that it sends the same controller message for both pressure and movement, or you can program different messages. In this setup, I have the small ribbon set so that by pressing on it, I can control the amplitude, and by moving my finger back and forth, I can alter the pitch. This allows me to create a vibrato with the same type of technique that a string player would. The 2 wheels are typical of what is found on many keyboards. The left one is normally used for pitch bend and springs back to center, while the right wheel is normally used as a standard mod wheel. Above the wheels are 2 buttons. These buttons can be set to momentary, so that they are only on while you press them, or they can be set to toggle, so that each time you press the button it turns on or off. In our preset programs and setups, they are often used to turn the arpeggiator on and off, and to change effects. Now let's look at the back of the instrument. You will find the typical power, MIDI, SCSI, and audio connections, along with the KDS port, which is used to connect to the optional DMTI using Kurzweil's proprietary digital format. There's also a knob for changing the display contrast. If you have the sampling option, you will see analog and digital sample input and digital output connectors. For keyboard owners, you will also see jacks for plugging in 4 switch pedals, 2 continuous controller pedals, and a breath controller. We'll be showing some examples of using these controllers later in the video. Let's take a moment to talk about the audio outs. You will see there are 10 configured as pairs labeled Mix, A, B, C, and D. It's important to understand that even though there are 10 jacks, there are only 8 routable outs. Here's the way it works. When you route a signal, you choose the A, B, C, or D pairs in the appropriate panning position. For the purposes of following along with this video, you should have two cables plugged into either the mix outs or the A pair. I'll be explaining how to use multiple outs in this section on effects, so if you want to try that, you should plug cables into the A, B, C, and D pairs of outputs.